Hello and welcome to The Hated and the Dead with Tom Lehman, for what will be our final episode of 2022. The podcast will return on the 9th of January in the new year with a look at Argentine icon Juan Perón. As I often say on this show, predicting the future is something of a fool's game, but it's also an entertaining one. Few would have wagered at the start of this year that in 2022, my own country would see 2 monarchs, 3 prime ministers, one lasting 45 days, 3 home secretaries with one serving twice, and 4 chancellors. To paraphrase John Prescott, in one of my favourite political put-downs, the government has become so green it's now recycling its own leaders. As you'll all know, many of my episodes deal with current events, and one of the drawbacks of this is that politics never stands still. In October, I spoke to Adriana Caranca about the upcoming presidential election in Brazil, and we concluded that Lula da Silva was on course for an easy win. Though he did win, it seemed for a few days as if Jair Bolsonaro might do the impossible and claw back a second term, leaving mine and Adriana's analysis of the situation sounding perhaps rather sanguine. Last year, I covered Silvio Berlusconi in the expectation that his years in government were behind him. But this year, at the age of 86, Berlusconi proved a kingmaker in Italian politics yet again. 2022 then was hardly a conventional year in politics, and there are many things that will happen in 2023 that we simply can't foresee. Many events and non-events, important things not happening, will determine our collective future. But to make any attempt at making predictions for the road ahead, we have to at least start by looking at what we know is happening in the world right now. The best we can hope to do, rather than staring into the ether and foreseeing complex and specific events, is to identify the big trends which will continue to unfold during the 2020s. The big picture, if you like. So for this episode, I've asked 3 of my guests from this year to make a return to The Hated and the Dead, to update us on the politicians and the events they spoke to me about. These returning guests are Aaron Friedberg, whom I interviewed about Xi Jinping in September, Oliver Moody, who spoke to me about Angela Merkel, and Martin Plaut, who spoke to me about Isaias Afwerki, the butcher of Tigray and instigator of the deadliest war on earth right now. In terms of the big picture, these 3 stories, as you're about to hear, suggest a world dividing further into blocks of influence led by the United States and China. Curiously though, with recession and the COVID legacy atrophying economic strength in both camps, we seem to be living through an era of stalemate, where neither side is making serious advances against the other. No story this year has epitomised this malaise more than China's zero COVID policy. So first, I caught up with the American academic, Aaron Friedberg, to talk about the anti-lockdown protests that have rocked China in recent weeks. We spoke just before the Communist Party Congress in September. Xi seemed pretty unassailable at that point. And indeed, he went on to kind of promote loyalists and be selected to lead China for another 5-year term. But then we've had these protests over the last few weeks. Xi seemingly has never had more control over the Communist Party and the apparatus of government. Has he ever had less control over the Chinese people?
Well, this is certainly, this has been the most dramatic manifestation of popular protests against policies that he was associated with. And at least a few of these protests named him, or individuals named him, and complained about his leadership. So it's dramatic in that sense. But I think it would be a mistake to conclude that this in some way indicates a loss of control on his part or a weakening of his rule or the emergence of alternatives or factions that might oppose his policies. So it's a combination of things, the consolidation of his power and the kind of boiling over of this popular discontent with one particular set of policies that he's been associated with.
Xi's government seems to be lifting the anti-COVID measures known as the zero COVID policy. Do you think zero COVID is over now? Is there any going back to that state of affairs?
I don't think so. I think that is the significance of what's happened. And the way in which it's happened, I suppose, is another manifestation of the centralization of power and control in the Chinese system. The fact that you could go from commitment to a policy which has been sustained over a period of years and justified, vociferously defended by party officials and implemented very rigorously, almost overnight, to an abandonment of those policies, which appears to be what's happened. I don't think there's any going back to zero COVID or any variant of that. I think the leadership has made the decision to abandon that, to face the consequences of this change of policy, which is likely to mean a significant increase in the number of deaths associated with COVID and at least temporary dislocation, economic dislocation, which will be quite severe, in the expectation that in a matter of months, on the other side of that, the situation will stabilize and begin to improve. And they hope that they can get back to something more closely resembling business as usual.
One of the things I've sort of realized over the last few weeks as I've been reading about this problem is how bad China's health system is. I read the other day that 42% of doctors there don't have a university degree of any kind. Forget medical degree, just any sort of higher education. When in sort of 2021, the zero COVID policy began to become notable, obviously, because Europe and America was starting to move away from that type of policy. That policy started to stick out like a sore thumb. There's been this kind of narrative that the government in China were just doing this policy to show how powerful they were. It was just authoritarians doing authoritarian things. Do you think that we're now actually finding out, given how bad China's health system is, that this had a more rational underpinning to it? That the CCP were terrified of revealing how bad their health system was, and that actually this policy was born out of weakness rather than strength?
Well, they certainly recognized the weakness of the system. And I think that's one of the reasons why they took so long to reverse course, because they knew it was likely going to result in a dramatic spike in cases, an increase in the number of deaths, and just an overwhelming of the existing system, which is not very good. It's very uneven. There are large swaths of the country, the rural areas, that have very poor hospitals, healthcare. It's all pretty much concentrated in the cities, but even there, the number of beds are not sufficient to deal with the expected increase in cases. What's puzzling is that they didn't take advantage of the sort of time that they had bought themselves in order to strengthen the healthcare system in the expectation that eventually they would have to go through something like this. They seem to have believed that if they could avoid the worst effects of the initial variants of the disease, eventually it would go away. So it appears that they didn't, like many others, they didn't anticipate the emergence of these new, somewhat less deadly but more infectious variants, which are now running wild in China and have burned through the populations of developed countries, other advanced industrial countries as well. They just don't seem to have thought this thing through. I think they believed that if they could survive this initial wave, eventually it would ebb in the rest of the world, and they could emerge from their fortified position and continue as they'd been doing before. But instead, of course, the virus has mutated and these new variants have emerged, and they're very susceptible and very vulnerable to them. And they just have not prepared adequately to deal with that.
There is also a real social stigma around having had the virus. Is that right?
Yes. And that's partly, I think, because of the way in which the regime has pursued its anti-COVID policies. So very rigorous enforcement. People being locked in their apartments, and not just individuals who had tested positive, but virtually everybody around them also having to endure these lockdowns. So it was not something that people wanted to acknowledge, or certainly didn't want to go through. Now, evidently, the regime has changed course in its the way in which it talks about the disease, and is saying, well, these new variants they're very contagious, but they're much less deadly, and this will pass. And there is some truth in that, but they're dealing with a population that's been traumatized by not so much by the disease as by the regime's efforts to suppress the disease. And they have to work their way through that now in order to get to something that's more stable on the other side. So people apparently are, on the one hand, they were protesting against these lockdowns. On the other, it appears now that people are isolating themselves. There have been runs on various kinds of medications, anti-fever medications, and so on. People really don't want to get the disease. They certainly don't want to have anything like the experience that they've had in the last several years of being locked down or forcibly confined in these massive, you can't even call them hospitals, but places in which they've isolated those who tested positive. Apparently, though, that's all being abandoned. This whole structure is being shut down, and it's not clear that anything really is being put in its place. They're going to let the virus run its course, which means that eventually and pretty quickly a large portion of the population will have been exposed and will have gotten sick. Some much smaller fraction of those people who get sick will suffer serious effects, and some of them will die. But I think they're looking to the other side of this and hoping that once this has burned its way through the population, they'll be able to get back to something more closely resembling normality. So this spike in infections and in fatalities that they've tried to avoid, I think they've concluded they can't avoid it if they want to get back to normality. And so they're just plowing ahead. And we don't yet know because the reporting is not very good. The statistics may be doctored. We probably won't know with great accuracy how many people actually die from the disease, but it's going to be a significant number. And there have been estimates in the past week that there's something like 1 million new cases every day, and that they may be experiencing something like 5,000 fatalities a day, I believe. And there are some estimates that, depending on different scenarios or assumptions, they could have as many as 2 million fatalities over the next several months. And of course, that's very dramatic, even for a country that has a population over 1 billion. A lot of people are going to die.
The question, I suppose, is that now that the concept of protests has come up once, protests against the zero COVID policy, if this opening up does go really badly and there are millions of fatalities, do you think people will return to the streets?
I suppose it's possible, but it seems to me that the protests that we saw were they were not organized. There was the result of tremendous frustration with the impositions that people suffered as a result of the government's effort to control the spread of the disease. And people were just fed up with it, sick and tired of being locked down. They'd rather sort of take their chances in a less constrained environment. It seems to me we can kind of understand how that came about. Again, it's kind of mass frustration. And then there were some particular cases in which the regime didn't act quickly enough in order to save people's lives. There was this one case of fire that burned through a housing complex in which people had been confined and they died, and the fire services weren't able to get to them. You can sort of see how anger over all of this would boil over. We don't know for sure, but that seems a little different than protests that we might imagine about the consequences of this new set of policies. Are people going to be protesting because they're family members died, maybe, but it's less obvious what the target is. I think there was a clear target before, and eventually there were protests aiming at that target. It's a little harder for me to imagine protests other than sort of spontaneous protests, expressions of anger and frustration as a result of excessive deaths in response to the new reality. In fact, I would have to think to the contrary, that when people are sick, recovering from being sick, when they're afraid of being exposed, it seems to me less likely that they're going to be out protesting. Moreover, and this is something that's always important to remember, the regime has a highly developed capacity for preempting and suppressing any kind of organized protests. They can monitor and shut off social media. They have a huge reserve of police and the People's Armed Police. It's like a second army for controlling popular protests. They've been preparing to deal with social unrest for decades now, and they've got a very strong capacity to deal with it if it should emerge. So I guess I don't really expect to see anything on a large scale, anything organized. Having said all of that, you do wonder about the lingering effects of this whole experience on people's attitudes towards the regime and towards Xi Jinping and his leadership. And from what we can gather, up until fairly recently, he was pretty popular, and people seemed favorably inclined towards the things that he was doing. You wonder if that is going to be eroded now by what people have gone through, both in the run-up to this and now in the change of direction. Even if it doesn't lead to protests, which I wouldn't expect that it would on a large scale, is it going to produce a kind of lingering cynicism, skepticism, resentment towards the party and its dictates? That, I think, is quite likely.
I was thinking about this the other day. I'd just be interested to see what you think, just to finish. There have definitely been periods in history, especially since World War II, where it seems like no side and no country in the world is doing very well. Everybody just seems to be sort of doing badly. When you look at what's going on in the Western world with high inflation, political polarization, Russia bogged down in Ukraine, and now China really struggling over this element of its politics. Are we in one of those periods of history? You might look at, say, the 70s as one of those eras as well, where just nobody seems to be kind of coming forward and doing well.
That is possible. There's another way of looking at this, and it may be premature to say this, but there is some reason to think that the Western countries, advanced industrial democracies in Europe, in Asia, the United States, have passed through the worst of this and may now be in a position where their performance is going to improve, their politics may stabilize, their societies are going to be functioning more effectively, and their economies are going to begin to bounce back. They've mobilized themselves to resist aggression in the case of Russia and Ukraine. They have implemented policies which, if you can give full credit to the policies, but the combination of the policies and the natural course of the disease has allowed for the reopening of economies and societies in the advanced industrial world, most countries in the advanced industrial world. And by contrast, the major authoritarian powers seem to be entering a period in which they're experiencing much greater difficulty than they were before. And there are real questions about their performance and even perhaps about their longevity. This is obviously the case with Russia, which until February of this year, many people thought it was a military giant, even if it had other kinds of societal problems, and now is greatly reduced. Its reputation for power, for strategic acuity, all of that has been greatly diminished on the one hand, and is not going to be restored anytime soon. And then in the case of China, China seemed to be riding high, sustaining high levels of growth, seemed for a while at least to have fended off the worst of the pandemic. And now it's going through its own terrible experience with the disease. And it's also encountering serious economic headwinds, which are only partly to do with the pandemic, but have also to do with fundamental flaws in their system, excessive debt, the heavy reliance on real estate to stimulate growth, things that couldn't go on forever and now are likely to have to change. And they're encountering much more resistance from the West, not just from the United States, but from countries in Asia, countries in Europe as well, which is manifesting itself in a variety of ways, including greater investments in defense, but also in policies that are going to insulate these advanced industrial democracies economically and technologically to some degree from China, which is something the Chinese regime has been very eager to avoid, but what now seems unavoidable. That's obviously the case with the U.S., which has now imposed very serious restrictions on trade in semiconductors and semiconductor manufacturing equipment. We're on the verge of banning one of the big social media platforms, TikTok, that has been so successful. And it's not just us, maybe lagging behind to varying degrees, but countries in Europe are also beginning to re-examine their economic relationship with China. And that's happening for a variety of reasons. But I think one of those reasons is the catastrophic experience of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the recognition that terrible things can happen. Dictatorial regimes can behave very aggressively, and being dependent on this kind of regime, whether it's for energy or semiconductors or other manufactured goods, is dangerous. This is something that began to sink in, I think, first with the pandemic and the realization that we were so heavily dependent on China for personal protective equipment and so on. And now that I think that realization is spreading, and we're beginning to see, not just in the US, but in other advanced industrial democracies, policies that are drawing back from this very close interconnection with and dependence on China. And that means, rough sailing ahead for China. So one interpretation of what we're going through is terrible in so many different respects, but may also be stimulating a more effective response on the part of the democracies and putting the authoritarian regimes in a much more difficult position going forward. And we're going to see that, that gap in their performance increasing as time goes on.
Thank you, Aaron.
Thank you.
So there you have it. No matter where China is headed in the new year, it seems we in the West will inevitably feel the consequences for good or ill. And Europe seems to be waking up to this. Countries which 3 or 4 years ago appeared to be growing weary of the EU and Trump's America, making furtive glances eastward to China and Russia, have for now re-emerged into the Western fold. But difficult decisions lie ahead, and for no country is this truer than for Europe's largest economy, Germany. With Chancellor Olaf Scholz heading into his second full year in office, and coordinating his country's response to the Ukraine crisis, I started by asking my second guest, Oliver Moody, how well he thinks Scholz has adapted to being a quasi-wartime leader.
That depends on what kind of leadership you're looking for and how you judge it. Germany obviously is not a party to the war in Ukraine, and largely the government, besides supporting Ukraine and providing diplomatic backup to the broader Western efforts to isolate Russia, has really just been trying to cushion its own population and corporate world from the consequences of the war. And so I really think you have to kind of disaggregate the different ways in which Germany has responded to this crisis, and also to just look at what a profound existential shock it has been to the whole edifice of German policy that existed not just after the fall of the Berlin Wall in the sort of end of history period, but even going back to the very kind of comfortable accommodation with the USSR under Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik from the end of the 1960s.
One of the terms that I've heard describe Scholz's approach to dealing with the Ukraine crisis has been that he's been quite plodding. He's got quite a slow approach in many ways to international relations. And I suppose whilst that's a bit stilted, a lot of people might argue that it's cannier and probably overall better than the kind of Macron approach of striding the world stage. There's a lot of bluster with him, obviously. But maybe he's not getting an awful lot done either. In terms of contrasting what people would see as the two primary EU leaders, how would you assess who has sort of come off better from the crisis so far?
Between Macron and Scholz?
Yes.
I would say I've found it extraordinary the extent to which France has broadly been spared criticism despite its intransparency over the support that it's actually given Ukraine and its much more explicit overtures towards Putin. Scholz made a speech to the Bundestag on February the 27th, 3 days after the invasion, which contained two kind of important elements. The first was the announcement that Germany would hit its NATO obligation to spend 2% of its GDP on defence, and the second was that it would partly do so by borrowing a special fund of 100 billion euros to rearm Germany's armed forces, the Bundeswehr. And by German standards, that was immensely fast and imaginative and decisive as a response, and bought Scholz a lot of time. Subsequently, he's broken a number of taboos, not least the constraint Germany had undertaken not to send weapons directly into an active conflict zone, and provided a fairly hefty chunk of munitions, not necessarily relative to Germany's GDP, but certainly relative to its military industrial capabilities in their kind of diminished post-Cold War state. Some aspects of the German state apparatus have moved extraordinarily fast, almost unprecedentedly fast. A few weeks ago, the first floating regasification terminal opened up on the North Sea coast for importing LNG, and from conception to execution, it took 194 days, which has been almost inconceivable a year ago.
Do you think Merkel would have done all of those things?
This has been a question I've asked myself very often. I think a lot of the technical aspects of Germany's response that have been good, particularly on the energy front and in terms of the sort of cost of living relief package, would definitely have a Merkelish feel to them. Whether she would necessarily have had the boldness or even just the kind of fresh energy to announce that this was really a kind of epochal shift in Germany's understanding of its place in the world, as Scholz did, I'm becoming to doubt. And there's been this whole motif that Germany has moved throughout this crisis at the speed of shame. I'm not sure that is necessarily true in every respect of the Scholz government, but I do feel fairly sure that it might well have been true of a Merkel-led government in this situation.
I was looking at a poll a couple of days ago that was released in Germany, and it detailed the opinions of members of different political parties concerning the response to the Ukraine crisis, and it generally showed that the parties of the left were more supportive of the measures than the parties of the right. There was actually a surprisingly low level of support from Merkel's party, the Christian Democratic Union. As we move into 2023, how far do you think you will see the maybe permissive consensus on supporting Ukraine beginning to fray within Germany?
This is absolutely the central question that Germany's partners have been asking constantly over the past few weeks, particularly after Scholz made a very ambivalent set of remarks at a conference recently, suggesting that ultimately the kind of pre-war, what he called the peace order, ought to be restored. And really, it's a question of what you mean by the permissive consensus. It's pretty clear that Germany just cannot afford to sustain the level of military support it's been providing to Ukraine simply because it's running out of materiel. And I would definitely expect to see the rate at which it's supplying weapons decline over the coming months. At the same time, I think almost regardless of shifts in public opinion, this challenge to Germany's economic, foreign and security policies has been so profound and such a shock to the system that there's absolutely no going back to the way things were before. What there is perhaps is a kind of limited window of opportunity in which to sustain this momentum and this pace of reform and this idea that there is a direction of travel towards something better rather than kind of slipping into the sort of ideological vacuum and drift that began to prevail in the last 4 or 5 years of the Merkel chancellorship.
I want to talk briefly about China. When we spoke previously, you mentioned that Scholz was imminently going to visit China's President Xi, and visit he did, in the midst of, I think, a period where it's not entirely clear how Germany-China relations are going to play out. How did that visit go?
The Chancellery were very pleased because they had been under a great deal of pressure, particularly from France and the US, not to step out of line. There's a lot riding on the trip, and Scholz was very much expected to represent the West's common positions on questions like Xinjiang, Taiwan, and the various other security and human rights issues in China's neighbourhood, and he did so. And he also extracted, a fairly symbolic and cryptic, but nonetheless public remark from President Xi, warning Russia against threatening to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. I think he was on the whole very happy with how things went, and basically passed the test insofar as he could have done. The longer term question now is who is going to prevail between Scholz's chancellery, which wants to very much kind of maintain a business-like relationship with China, more or less along the same contours that we had before the war, and Annalena Baerbock's Green-led foreign ministry, which is drawing up the new China strategy that we published in the spring, we think, and really wants to put much more emphasis on values, on climate change, on drawing up the areas in which China has really become a kind of systemic rival, to use the terminology that's come to dominate this discussion, rather than a partner.
I suppose if you look at the Western approach to China as a whole, things like Xinjiang, Taiwan, and encouraging China to put pressure on Putin, in a way these are the things that are easy to generate consensus in the West. That it's not obvious how you engage with China on them, clearly, but they're things where consensus is fairly easy to reach. If you look at the pricklier issues of trade, though, do you think that Scholz actually knows how he wants to approach China? Obviously, Merkel was criticised, especially in the last sort of half of her chancellorship, with perhaps being a little too close to China. Going forward, do you think Scholz is clear in his own mind about how he wants to approach that issue, the things that actually might generate more chagrin, especially from Washington?
I would draw a distinction between the short-term objectives and the kind of long-term scenarios in which German-Chinese relations might wind up. In the short term, I think Scholz has been pretty clear, particularly in the run-up to the visit and during the visit itself in Beijing, that Germany is pushing for more of a level playing field in terms of things like market access and state aid. He wants to clarify the extremely confusing conditions for Chinese investment in possibly kind of sensitive infrastructure in Germany, things like microchip manufacturers or physical infrastructure like ports or the power grid. And the third short-term objective that Scholz has expressed pretty clearly is to identify the kind of concentrations of economic dependence where Germany is relying too much on China for comfort, and then to kind of diversify his way out of them rather than explicitly decoupling from China. But in the longer term, I think there hasn't been anything like enough attention paid, especially in the Chancellery, where there really isn't that much in-house China expertise, to what happens to this economic interdependence if the geopolitics get more complicated. And in particular, the scenario that really doesn't seem to be on the radar or anything like as much as it should be is what happens if China attacks Taiwan, and then German companies, with all of their involvement in China, find themselves expected to comply with US-led sanctions, which could be absolutely ruinous. And one would hope that a big part of the China strategy will be thinking that through and trying to find ways to hedge against the potentially disastrous consequences of the geopolitics blowing up between China and the West over the coming years.
Very quickly, on a more sort of boring note, we're just over a year into the Scholz chancellery. In domestic terms and the fairly run-of-the-mill politics of who's up, who's down, how is he doing? How is his government doing?
Not well, if you purely follow the polls. There's only one minister in his entire cabinet who has a net positive approval rating, and that's Annalena Baerbock, the foreign minister, who's on +1. Scholz himself has an approval rating of 36%. His party, the SPD, is sort of bobbling along at about 20% of the polls, sort of 8 or 9 or 10 points behind the Christian Democratic opposition. The broader polls about satisfaction with the government's work as a whole suggest that broadly about 2/3 of the public is really not very happy with how things are going. And if you compare that to the Merkel era, those are extremely poor numbers. Merkel's approval rating was very seldom below 60%. In Scholz's defense, though, I think this is a very different situation where there is a profoundly difficult economic climate, where he's running a very experimental three-party coalition that still hasn't quite been bedded in and is still working out a lot of its priorities in real time. And above all, Scholz is not a guy who pays anything like as much assiduous attention to opinion polls as the Merkel chancellery did. He's always been extremely confident and secure in his long-term political strategy. And just as the SPD picked itself up from a nadir of something like 13 or 14% in the polls to win the last Bundestag election, he definitely believes that this is just a kind of temporary state of affairs and that ultimately calm, consistent leadership is what is going to win him the next election.
I imagine that blinkers that he has with regards to the polls is probably to his credit, at least at this point, this early in a term. Oliver, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Whilst Europe is embroiled in and distracted by a war on its own continent, few Europeans realise that the deadliest war of recent times has not been happening in Ukraine, but in a remote corner of Ethiopia called Tigray. In October, I interviewed journalist and author Martin Plaut about Eritrean President Isaias Afwerki, probably the man more responsible than any other for a war that has claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. Isaias wants a disunited and weakened Ethiopia to increase his own leverage and influence in East Africa, and sees the war in Tigray as a feasible but risky way of achieving this. However, only a few weeks after Martin and I spoke, a tentative ceasefire was reached between the warring factions, so I thought an update was probably needed. Martin, we spoke in mid-October at a point when the war in Tigray, initiated and carried out largely on the orders of Isaias Afwerki, the president of Eritrea, had been raging for nearly 2 years. By some estimates, this has been the deadliest conflict in the world this decade so far. There has been quite an important development since we spoke. What happened in early November? Can you explain?
Well, after a lot of, shall we say, preparatory work, which was done mostly by the Americans, there had been, I think, 3 or 4 meetings, sort of behind the scenes, in places like Djibouti and maybe the Seychelles. Finally, there was a meeting, an official meeting, with cameras and all the rest of it in Pretoria, at which an initial agreement was made between the Tigrayans and the Ethiopians. It was signed, but it was a strange agreement because there were lots of bits of it which didn't make a lot of sense. Nonetheless, it was signed, and then a further agreement was signed in Nairobi in Kenya. So you had 2 agreements which sort of interlocked, and there was supposed to be the disarmament of the Tigrayans, and they recognized that only the Ethiopian forces would be allowed to operate in anywhere in Ethiopia, but that the disarmament would only take place when there were only Ethiopian troops inside Tigray. Now, the problem with that was that there are still a lot of Eritrean troops inside Tigray, and there are a lot of other militia forces, like the Fano, who are Amhara forces, and some other forces who are there as well. As a result, nothing as much has happened. I mean, the disarmament was supposed to have taken place by the 18th, and there was supposed to be a monitoring process, but it hasn't happened. But the war has sort of stuttered to a halt, if you see what I mean. There isn't major fighting going on at the moment inside Tigray, but nor are the forces who should have left, nor have they left. Some aid convoys have gone in. Some towns now have electricity and have been connected to the internet. Some have not. The Ethiopians who were supposed to fly into Mekelle, the capital of Tigray, were supposed to go in and take over, but they haven't arrived yet. So difficult to know how to assess this. It's sort of a half-on, half-off ceasefire and peace agreement.
When we spoke in October, we talked about this issue of, in a sense, the tail wagging the dog. That you have the government of Eritrea making decisions and then expecting the Ethiopian government to react in turn. What is the relationship between those 2 governments at the moment?
I wish that was clear. It really isn't. And almost anything you say is fraught with danger because, yes, that is the situation as I understand it, that President Isaias has been the major driver in the war. But, to what extent he is now waiting to see what Prime Minister Abiy does, I don't know. He's started reaching out to other groups, like he met with a group of Sudanese today. Does he plan to do something in Sudan or with particular groups in Sudan? That has been suggested to me. There's a lot that might be going on beneath the surface. There's also a suggestion that the Somali troops, who you may remember were involved in the war in the beginning, are now going to be allowed to go home. They've been in Eritrea ever since the war began. In fact, they were there earlier. And President Isaias was twice asked by the president of Somalia to allow them to go home, and he didn't respond really well. So something seems to have been arranged, but again, we're not terribly sure what. So I'm afraid, since there are no independent media on the ground in either in Eritrea at all, or in the war zones in Tigray, it's not too easy to find out what's happening.
Ethiopia is an immensely diverse country ethnically. I think it nearly has 100 identifiable ethnic groups within it. It's worth noting that whilst this war in Tigray has been going on, there have been conflicts and there has been disquiet in other parts of Ethiopia as well. Where do you think the Tigray ceasefire and this sort of stuttering to a halt, as you put it, of the violence in Tigray, where does it leave the rest of Ethiopia and the other conflicts?
Well, it seems that the Prime Minister Abiy has, the Prime Minister of Ethiopia has pulled some of his troops out of Tigray and has moved them down into Oromia, the Oromo being the largest ethnic group in Ethiopia. About a third of all Ethiopians are Oromo, but they come, shall we say, in many clans and many subgroups. And the Oromo Liberation Army has begun fighting the Ethiopian army in a lot of places, and there is a lot of fighting going on. But as one quite well informed source said, maybe an hour ago, there's so much misinformation about what is going on. It's hard to know what's happening there, but clearly there is a lot of fighting going on in Oromia. Also, the Amhara, upon whom the Prime Minister based a lot of his support, some of them have also become very disillusioned with Prime Minister Abiy. And some of them are now in Eritrea and are being trained by the Eritreans. What the Eritreans are going to use them for, I have no idea. But you can see that's another bargaining chip in all of this. I'm sorry this sounds like a complete mess, and that one that I don't understand particularly well. I mean, I think all one can say is that there are a lot of blurred images which are hard to interpret. What we're sure is that there is conflict, lots of people are being killed, there are lots of atrocities taking place, there are any number of really ghastly images on the internet that you can see of bodies and allegations of mass murders. And the problem is trying to sort any of this out is extremely difficult when, most journalists are not allowed in to report it.
I spoke to Michaela Wrong recently about the situation in Rwanda. And one of the things that came out of that conversation was the notion of sort of geopolitical failure on a vast scale that happened in Rwanda in the 90s and in a way has continued to this day, largely because the international community doesn't seem to care very much about what happens in Central Africa and in Rwanda. Do you think that's true of Ethiopia and Eritrea as well, that the international community just put simply haven't really got the bandwidth to deal with this or care?
I think there is some truth to it, and it's interesting that I've just been looking at some files that are being released at the end of this month in 10 days' time by the National Archive in Britain, which look at Tony Blair's time in the 2000s when there was another war between Eritrea and Ethiopia, and seeing what he did then, and I mean, without revealing what is still under wraps until that moment, I mean, the assessment is that Britain doesn't have a lot of skin in the game, shall we say. And, my guess is that a similar assessment would probably be made by the Foreign Office today. What's in it for Britain? Yes, you can argue that Eritrea is on the Red Sea, which is strategic, but then, so is Djibouti, and so are lots of other countries. And you can't worry about everywhere. The major concerns surely in the world are Ukraine, China, and there's not a lot apart from that. Then you get down to things like environmental issues and biodiversity. And if you were the prime minister in London or Paris or a leader in the United States, those would be top of your agenda, not what's going on in Addis Ababa or Asmara.
Even if the British, the French, the Americans did have the sort of will and time to dedicate to this part of the world, is there anything looking ahead to 2023 that you think they could do that would quickly make the situation better?
Well, it would be possible to, up the ante and increase sanctions on anyone who's involved in or seen to be involved in perpetrating the war. There are already some sanctions, but they are quite limited and particularly apply to Eritrea and named Eritreans and named Eritrean organizations, but not Eritrea as a whole. There's no economic sanctions against Eritrea as there was, for example, against South Africa during the apartheid era. And there's not very much against the Ethiopians. So you could increase that if you wanted to. You could also impose a no-fly zone over Tigray if you wanted to. The United States is capable of any of these things. But, would they really want to put themselves in harm's way in that way? I can't see it happening. The big sort of effort at the moment is to back the Somali government. And there they are really trying quite hard and have put a lot of effort into the new Somali president and attempting to defeat Al-Shabaab, the Islamist group that's been fighting in Somalia for years and years. And Al-Shabaab are being driven back, partly because the new president actually opposes them rather than, shall we say, only appearing to oppose them. So things are changing, and it's not as if nothing can be done. Things can be done. It just requires effort, energy, and determination. After all, Mrs. Thatcher, with Ethiopian permission, to be fair, dropped aid into Ethiopia. She brought the Royal Air Force in and dropped aid into areas that couldn't be reached in other ways. It's one of the options that's always available to a prime minister if they want to. Do they want to do it? I don't think so.
So, after listening to those, what predictions can we make about the world next year? It seems likely that the bifurcation of the world along pro-US and pro-Chinese lines will make the world more protectionist, more dangerous, less plentiful, and less effective in dealing with endemic challenges in 2023, such as climate change and wars of attrition like those in Ukraine and Tigray. Disorder and instability are increasingly the norms in politics. Over the last year, I've asked many questions about what might happen in the near future. Will China invade Taiwan? Will Westminster politics settle amid its current instability? Will Scotland leave the Union? Will the Islamic regime in Iran fall? Will Jacinda Ardern fail to reignite her dwindling premiership? Will Poland or Hungary or both decide to leave the EU? Will Ukraine and Georgia join? Will the Supreme Court destroy democracy in the United States? Will the Balkans descend once again into chaos? Will the Taliban fail to unite Afghanistan? Whether all of these situations, or indeed any of them, play out in 2023 is anyone's guess. But what we can be certain of is that the wider context of instability we are now seeing makes all of them more likely to happen in the longer run. All that we, who live in the middle of this, can hope to do is survive the worst of the fallout. And through these episodes, I hope I, and by extension you, can make sense of a confusing and sometimes rather frightening world. Thank you to everyone who listened to The Hated and the Dead in 2022, and I wish you all a happy and healthy 2023.